Hello, wonderful women. This is Claudia from Nourished by Claudia, and today I'm super honored to have Holly Dunn here with me. Did I say it correctly? Holly Dunn?
Yes. Yes.
I always, I never know if I pronounce the name correctly. So
Yes.
Holly, and I just check my notes because I don't want to forget anything, is a registered nutritionist, is a clinical nutritional therapy practitioner with a specialty in HA and also disorder eating behaviors and eating disorders. And something that I didn't know is that you're also fully qualified yoga teacher.
Yes.
Wow,
Right.
you're wearing so many hats. So welcome, Holly.
Thank you. Thank you.
How are you?
I am really, really good. And thank you so much, Claudia, for having me, because I've been, aware of your presence on social media for ages, and we've crossed paths. I know we've exchanged messages, and this conversation has just been a long time coming. So it's just, yeah, I'm honored to be in your community. So thank you for having me.
And I'm so happy for having you here. And you're drinking a cup of hot chocolate, and I'm drinking coffee this morning because it's almost 10 o'clock in England. There we go. And it's 6 o'clock in Australia. So you're going to see the sunrise behind me very soon.
I've got my ring light, so I'm like trying to keep myself awake. But I'm good now.
It's so funny. So Holly, I think that a good place where to start is knowing who you are, and if you can share a little bit more about yourself, your story, and why you have an interest in hypothalamic amenorrhea and eating disorders. Would you like to start from there?
Yeah, of course, Claudia. Well, thank you. So as you've already said, I'm a registered nutritionist with a speciality in HA, more generally working at the kind of intersection between hormones and mental health in women. And what led me here was really my own passions early on growing up, but also my own experience of HA and burnout as well. Which are very, very linked conditions and scenarios. So I guess really to talk a little bit around, to go straight into my story, to help contextualize things for you guys. I've always, my whole life, I've been very sensitive. I was always a very sensitive child. And growing up, I was really susceptible to psychological stress and emotional stress. And I think, it was much later on in my life that I realized some of the kind of physiological and biochemical reasons behind that, which I'm very happy to share later. But essentially, I'd always had this conscientious nature. And then going to university, I went to do a master's degree at Edinburgh. I was there for 4 years, and the whole transition period in my life was a big one, moving away from home. I had very high academic expectations of myself, some personal family challenges, some relationship challenges at the time, and I was also faced at the time with this is something actually that I don't talk about on social media because is a little bit, you'll probably understand why, but my mum's health at that time was really she was really suffering from mental health disorder and a sort of an addiction type disorder, and that was very, very difficult for me to sort of cope with that. I found it very I was angry. I was angry and upset that this was happening, And I think my main coping mechanism around that time was turning to running. So running was something that I fell in love with. I got very fit very quickly. I've always naturally been quite lean, but I got very lean, and I liked that feeling, a little bit of control, there for sure. I didn't appreciate how much it was draining my energy either. And my excuse around it was that it was leading me to perform better in my studies, because I developed this kind of mental focus, that gives you this sharpness, this sharp focus that you get. So it was a little bit of a kind of misguided performance habit that I had. And things got quite intense at uni. I'd said in my 4th year, I was being asked to consider an MPhil or a PhD, which I thankfully didn't go ahead and do. But so a few things going on there around, work and the way I was operating. Now, at the same time, and sorry if I'm doing the long version of my story, but at the same time,
no, please go ahead.
I'd always been really, really fascinated by nutritional science, as I know you are too. I'd had a very rural upbringing in a tree. I grew up on a tree nursery surrounded by fruit trees, and I used to go picking fruit and vegetables every weekend. It was really lovely. And my mum was an amazing cook. She was really, really amazing. She used to do things like she used to make her own cashew nut butter and cauliflower steaks. Like, I'm pretty sure well before these things became trendy, you know.
Yeah.
And me and my sister were just, you know, we were never forced to eat anything. Actually, we were just but my mum always made us try everything. And so that love of kind of nutrition and plants and really being fascinated by it was something that I had from an early age, along with chemistry, which was my favorite subject at school. So all of this kind of in the background, I'm there at university, I'm studying really hard. I'm also really interested in nutrition. I'm running myself into the ground. So I found that, you know, my early to mid 20s were a time where I developed, as you would imagine, little spurts of orthorexia, you know, that kind of misguided understanding of health food and what was healthy for me. So that definitely played a role in my HA and burnout, which happened a little bit later on in my journey. When I left university, I went to do a few jobs initially that were tremendously stressful for me, partly because I knew in my heart I wasn't following my dream. I was sacrificing my values, my philosophies, my interests for something else, and that was very difficult for me. I'd got through orthorexia by this time. I think it wasn't really something that I'd managed to sort of had some really, really good CBT, and I think it was bubbling away there, but I'd actually managed to sort of deal with it quite nicely, actually. But I did end up having a bit of an existential crisis with my life and burning out, and then leaving my career progressively to go back and train for several years as a clinical nutritional therapy practitioner, which is what I think I always wanted to do. Yeah. But it took time to get there, and I had to transition through my job and then eventually give up my job to complete the studies, and that in itself was very stressful. And then finally, I guess it was this was the same sort of time when I left my job. I was doing the training full time when I came off the pill and realized that I had no period. And as with all of our stories, you know, I went to see my GP, I went to see the gynecologist. I was diagnosed with polycystic ovaries, but not syndrome. I had high prolactin, so they thought it might have been just my prolactinemia that was suppressing my cycles. And I eventually saw a gynecologist she sort of knew what was going on, but she looked at me and said, "You're quite athletic looking." But since I wasn't underweight, you know, she just suggested I consider less running, and asked me. She didn't really ask me any questions about my sort of food intake and whether or not if it was enough, how I was feeling, what my stress levels were like. So that in itself was enough for me to know through my training that I needed to research the hell out of this and understand what was going on with my body, and just piece myself back together, which I did. And it took me 2 years to get my period. I wasn't fully invested in my recovery initially. I was just trying to play around with a few things, figure things out. But then as I retrained, it's really what led me to really, really want to support women with this. And as we were just saying before we got onto this call, how much I feel so blessed to work with women and talk to women who have been through this, because we're just such a lovely group of people. I think, you know, when you pushed your body to that extent, you know.
I agree. We are such a bunch of lovely kids.
Yeah.
But you said something that it's we share actually lots of similarities. And you also mentioned that you went to see lots of doctors and you were diagnosed with polycystic ovaries, and also your gynecologist didn't really know what was going on. And also in my situation, it took me 5 years to finally get a GP that asked me how much I was eating and how much I was training, which is quite interesting considering that eating and moving, it's basically the basics of how we live our life. So it sounds like that in your situation, stress and running really cause your amenorrhea. Am I correct to say so?
Yeah, I think so. I always think, you know, the history of orthorexia is there in my mind. I think by the time I came off the pill, it was far more the running and the psychological stress. Still relative energy deficiency because of my activity level and my total workload. But yeah, I think so for me. Yeah, to be honest, I've never really been a hugely restrictive eater. I always ate a lot. I was just being took clean eating to an extreme. But it was still, I can still see it was clinically, you know, not good at a point. But for sure, I think the psychological stress side of it is a big one for me. And I'm really passionate about that element of things with women and doing, you know, really investigating why that might be, because there are a lot of physiological reasons why some people are more prone to stress. And unfortunately, I don't think that's perhaps listened to enough and understood enough, and especially with HA. So yeah, I think those are some of the key things anyway for me and my experience, but my personal, we're all different.
But thank you for also for doing all this work. I had a call with a GP, with a doctor last week, where I wanted to discuss the situation of one of my patients. And I said that possibly the stress was the last straw that was causing hypothalamic amenorrhea. And this doctor basically told me that stress factors cannot affect our hormonal health. And it's 2021. Yeah. And the first time that I lost my period, I know that I was going through a very very stressful situation. I had a huge amount of anxiety. I was dealing with anxiety and even panic attacks. And that's when I lost my period the first time. So how can you tell me that stress doesn't have anything to do with our hormonal health? So this is so backward, and I got really upset. But anyway, this is a completely different topic of conversation.
It scares me a lot, because actually, you know, we can't blame medical practitioners and doctors for not knowing enough about nutrition. That they don't know, they don't get enough, they get less than 20 hours usually.
They're not trained.
Yeah. No, exactly. So the nutrition part I get, but the stress, that I really don't understand that, because there's so much evidence to show multiple mechanisms by which you know, our stress axis influences our reproductive axis. So many different mechanisms have been shown that's actually quite alarming to hear that. So I am sorry.
It is, absolutely agree. It's very alarming. I would love to keep on talking about this, but first of all, let me ask you, because you were a runner, or you're a runner, I'm going to ask you that in a second. And we have so many runners out there. Did you manage to go back to your training after you got your period back? Because I'm pretty sure that they're going to ask me these questions as soon as I publish this.
Yeah, 100%. I still run. I'm still a morning runner as well, so I still run for sure. And I only gave it up. I didn't give it up for very long, actually. My burnout forced me to stop, because I developed glandular fever in my 20s.
Okay.
So I had to stop but I didn't stop for too long, actually. I felt that it was a wonderful time for me to actually force me to stop moving. And then when I recovered quite quickly, my nutrition was actually pretty robust. My psychological stress levels were amazingly improved. I have my other half to thank for that, because he was amazingly supportive. And so, yeah, so the running for me, I built it back in, actually, very in a way that worked for me. And I was lucky enough that I'm a little bit, I find running doesn't tax me out too much in terms of my heart rate. I can keep my heart rate relatively low, because I do if I do a very, very slow, you know, I can still talk to people. I can hold a full conversation whilst I'm jogging, you know, like, so it was really, I really adapted it to what I wanted to do. And I never did it out of a place of a must or a need or a should. I did it because I wanted to be out in nature or something, and it was a good place for me. So it's a tricky one because I've had that dependency on it in the past, but I weaved it back in, quite quickly actually.
And so let me ask you, what's your thought on running on an empty stomach? For example, waking up at 5 o'clock in the morning and going out in a fasted situation, basically. How do you feel about that?
Well, there are a few things that what you just said there is interesting. Is waking up at 5 a.m., right? So you're probably already sleep deprived.
Yeah.
If you're waking up at that time in the morning to run, there's probably a drive of an I need to, or I should, which indicates that there could be some kind of stress motivator there as well, which also is not good. And then you've got the fasting, and then you've got the exercise. So it's never just one thing. So it's never just the exercise that would be the issue, right? So generally speaking, and I know you'll be the same, it really does depend on the individual, how long they've had HA, what they've tried, what their fueling is like, what their nutrient status is like, what their body composition is like, before I make that kind of that's not going to work, or this is going to work, or this is how we make that work. But generally speaking, fasted exercise, if you're in the depths of HA, especially fasted morning exercise, is really a no, because it's just not, it's going to set you back. But I have ladies that are generally, like really, really can't give up their exercise. Maybe they're athletes, or they don't want to, or for some other reason, we can talk a little bit around maybe the mindset around that. But also, if I fully respect, because I was quite stubborn, what it's like to not want to give it up. So we have to make it work. But fueling it is certainly very important. Sorry, I've gone a really roundabout way of saying basically no, it's not a good idea, because first thing in the morning cortisol is high, so you're in a fasted state, so cortisol levels are already high, and then you throw exercise in there as well. It's just going to cause a little bit of a hyperdrive situation in the morning, which we can see what happens on a Dutch test or a clinical test. We can see what's happening with the cortisol levels at that time in the morning if that happens.
Yeah, and the whole point is to make sure that your body feels safe, so then it can menstruate and ovulate and so on and so forth. So having high cortisol level in the morning, super high cortisol level in the morning, is never a good thing. But also, you mentioned something quite interesting. What would you say to a patient that comes to you and says, "Look, Holly, I can't give up running because that's when I feel good. That's when it's seriously one of my favorite things to do. It's my passion," but she's not an athlete. So you already know, as a nutritionist that works with hypothalamic amenorrhea, that you need to work on the mindset. But what do you say when this person presents to you and say those type of things?
So it's really interesting, and being totally honest with people and educating women is so important, because we want to support you for the rest of your life to be sustainable in anything you do. So in that scenario where there is that kind of, I need it for my mental health, like I need to do this for my mental health, we have to talk a little bit around, well, okay, from a kind of medical or a science point of view, actually, when it comes to mental health, we know that we're only looking at 150 minutes a week of moderate to vigorous exercise over 5 days. So that's around 30 minutes a day of something that's pretty moderate, that supports mental health. So that's what we know from studies that we've done and from the work that I've done with clients. And we don't actually need to do any more than that. And often it's the need to be outside or the need to be in nature that's having that beneficial effect. And so if we can frame it like that and just be realistic about what the need is to gain those endorphins or that mental health sort of safety net, or whatever that word is I'm looking for there, then then we have to understand a little bit more. Okay, so what is the real motivator? Is there a need? I should, what is the dependency and the drive there? Because at the end of the day, if we do add on, and I'm, firsthand experience of this, if you add on high volume, high intensity exercise to a stressed system, that's a recipe for burnout. And that's the problem. So it is finding a balance, and it is working with that individual to find out how we can make that work for you. You know, do we have to change up the time of what you're doing, or adjust the intensity or the volume, or fueling? I mean, let's think about how do we fuel that properly, because at the end of the day, it's HA is a result of relative energy deficiency, not food on its own, or exercise on it, certainly not exercise on its own. Yeah.
And in your personal situation, how do you fuel around the run or around any type of training that you do?
So a really good one for the first thing to say with that is you can train your body to, and a lot of women will say, I can't train, I can't have anything to eat, but you can train your body to take on fuel in any way, in the same ways you train a muscle, or you build your stress resilience. You can train your digestive system to accept some food before any form of training. But to start out with, even something like a glass of milk, it doesn't have to be dairy, it could be a plant-based milk with 1 or 2 scoops of a quality protein powder, like a nice quality protein powder is actually all you need really to get going. Depending on what the goal is, what you're doing, you know, how long you're going out for, maybe something like a couple of oat cakes and some banana is more suitable, or you know, some toast and honey is more suitable. It really depends again on what kind of training you're doing and what, you know, why you're doing it. And I guess understanding what your motivation is for anything is really, really important. But it doesn't have to be complicated. And most of the time when we're thinking about doing something, having something before exercises, it's usually something that's broken down pretty quickly in the body. So it's not necessarily a health food or a high fiber food, and it's certainly not a high fat food, although fats are so important the rest of the day or all of the rest of the time. But probably not right before exercise, because fats are hard to digest.
Yeah, they cannot be properly used to fuel your training, really. And I know that lots of women, they struggle also to have breakfast, for example, earlier on in the morning, so within the 2 hours after waking up. And I think that it's very common in the hypothalamic amenorrhea community, which is a kind of a worry, because lots of women, they do exercise in the morning. But you just said that sometimes we don't have to overthink it, and it's enough to have like a piece of toast with some honey, which is really easy to digest. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and it doesn't have to be big either. You know, it just has to be enough that your body is just getting a signal. There's enough glucose there, that your body is not in an alarmist state.
Exactly.
You know, to punch up that cortisol even further. Yeah.
And before I let you go, I really want to talk about caffeine as well.
Oh yeah, I love this.
Because
I love this topic.
and it's such a big thing for me. And before we started chatting, I told you, like, very honestly, it's 6 o'clock in the morning. I haven't had a proper breakfast this morning, and I already had a cup of coffee, which is something that I would have never done when I was recovering from HA. But now it's a different situation, and I know that I'm going to have a beautiful porridge with everything as soon as we finish talking. And tomorrow I'm going to treat my body differently. It's not a problem for me right now. But how would you do you feel about caffeine and hypothalamic amenorrhea recovery? Big loaded question.
Yeah, it's such a big question. I love it. Well, the first thing I would say is that what you've just described is so important for every woman with HA to know, is that if you love coffee, you can have it again. You know, there is a day where you can wake up, and just like Claudia is doing, you can wake up and have a coffee, because once the system is reset, you know, your body is able to withstand some of these extra stresses and things that are disturbing the balance. So when it comes to caffeine in recovery, I think the first thing that I want to mention, which I hate to say, but there is no direct evidence to link caffeine consumption with HA. There's no causal link, right? So there's no evidence either to say that you need to cut it out to recover. But, and a massive caveat to all of this is, I don't agree with certain, you know, that level of evidence, in the sense that all of these studies that have been done on caffeine and the menstrual cycle have been done in cycling women. Okay, they've not been done in women with HA. So we can't, find that may not have impacted their cycles or caused anovulation, but we can't use this, these very, very small studies here and there on cycling women. We can't really use those as a reference point. So we have to look at, okay, what's the effect of what's going on in HA and what's the effect of caffeine? Well, in HA, there tends to be a lot of sympathetic nervous system activity. There tends to be a lot of adrenaline, cortisol, hyperdrive, and one thing that we know that caffeine does very, very well is stimulate the central nervous system. And it does that by inhibiting a neurotransmitter called adenosine, which means that our adrenaline levels go up. And then a few minutes later, that stimulates our adrenal cortex, which means our cortisol levels go up. And if you're having your cup of coffee, which we typically like to do in the morning when cortisol levels are naturally high, you might be having it on an empty stomach. It might be as a result of, just a habit that you used to have. It suppresses your appetite. It tastes quite nice. It's not great, and it is going to fire up the cortisol levels, and it could just disturb the HPO and the HPA, both the HPO and the HPA axis. So the reproductive axis, and the stress system. So my view is that depending on where you are in HA and whether or not, I can usually tell whether someone is in the depths of HA, or if they're they're coming out of it, they're getting some really positive signals and stuff, whether or not caffeine is a good idea. And most of the time, it's not a great idea on an empty stomach, first thing in the morning. If we want to have it, we might want to taper down the dose a little bit. Think about using things like matcha green tea, which has a little bit of caffeine in it, but much less. And it's got a lovely calming amino acid in it as well, which helps to sort of regulate the central nervous system, always adding a fat to it, so to bolster the effects of cortisol. So there are different ways that you can still have your cup of coffee. It's not like we're saying don't have any, but if your main goal is to get your period back, have a baby, you really want to do this right now, then it can be really effective to take it out for a while and really just understand where your real stress and anxiety levels are. Because for a lot of women, caffeine does affect your stress levels. It does affect your subjective sense of, how calm you feel. So generally speaking, it's always something to look at, caffeine. Yeah, I would say, I personally think it is something to look at.
Absolutely. And I remember when I was going through HA recovery, I love my coffee. So I started having long blacks in the morning with coconut oil inside. And then after a while, I was like, yeah, but this is really not my thing, because you can taste the fat, right? It's not a long black anymore. It's like a concoction. So I'm like, maybe I switch to decaf coffee and I just leave it for a while after breakfast, and then I will come back to it. And now I'm back to it. But also, I would like to mention the caffeine is not only in a coffee, because, for example, as you said before, matcha contains caffeine, but also green tea, black teas, medications, chocolate, all the energy drinks, and even some supplements they do contain, especially the sports supplements, they contain lots of caffeine. So it's something that we really need to be aware of, because maybe you're saying, I'm just having one coffee a day, but at the end of the day, you have already introduce more than 400 milligrams of caffeine in your body without knowing, and then the real coffee is just on top of it.
It absolutely, and even most decaf coffees do have a small amount of caffeine actually. Yeah, so they'll have around, if say a standard cup of coffee has about 200 milligrams of caffeine, I think a decaf coffee has about 25 milligrams. So it's a small amount.
Sometimes,
but how many are you having? And then, are you having a Coke as well, a Coca-Cola? I despair when clients have Coke again. We often work with that, but Coca-Cola, supplements is a great one. Even some medications as well. Yeah, you've got to be, you're so right. And even, hot chocolate. I don't know how much caffeine.
And hot chocolate. And lots of people, they normally have the chocolate and the hot chocolate before going to sleep. And when they're going through HA and their sympathetic system is so in high alert, they have the hot chocolate before going to sleep and they can't go to sleep. And possibly it's because they've been introducing too much caffeine throughout the day. But anyway, thanks so much, Holly, for sharing your opinion. That was extremely interesting. And I'm so sorry that we don't have any research study for now that shows a connection between caffeine and hormonal health. And please, if you feel up for it, maybe it's time for you to write the first one.
Oh, I wish I could. Yeah, I know.
Well,
I think I will.
We desperately need it.
We just need to get enough
please.
women on board. We just need to get enough women on board to do the study, really, don't we? I'd say we need about
exactly.
400. Perfect.
There are lots of women following. Yeah. So, Holly, before I say goodbye and good night, do you want to share with us what you do and how you can help, especially all those beautiful women that are in Europe? Because I'm in Australia and sometimes the time difference is a huge problem. So if they want to find you, how can you serve them and all of that?
Thank you. And the first thing I want to say is actually it works both ways, because I've had a few calls with ladies over the last 3 months in Australia, and actually without really, us having a nice strong relationship, it's actually nice to know I can say, oh, you need to go and see Claudia a bit more. But I at this stage I only work with women one-to-one. I don't have any sort of online programs. I think it's maybe something that I look into soon, but at the moment I'm a one-to-one person. So you can find me on my website, which is www.hollydunn.co.uk. And I am, again, with a lot of things at the moment are sort of in flux. So I'm redoing that website. We'll be redoing it over the next few months with a little bit more of a focus on HA, and there'll be many more resources for HA, although there is a lot on there already that's applicable. And I'm on Instagram, although I've also had a little bit of a break from that this year because clinic's been busy, but I am bringing much more content and detail back into that sort of space soon. So that is Holly Dunn Nutrition. And if you're a corporate lady, I'm also on LinkedIn, just as Holly Dunn. So there are 3 ways you can find me. And if you want to work with me, you're very welcome to book a call with me on my website and we can have a chat and see how you're doing. And
you just mentioned that you have a busy clinic, so just make sure that you book her before she gets sold out.
I know. My calls at the moment, there's a little bit of a waiting time, but it's not too much actually. It's only a matter of a couple of weeks, hopefully.
We actually love that. As a clinical nutritionist, I love when there is a waiting list.
Yeah.
But anyway.
Really good. But thank you so much for having me. Yeah, it's been lovely.
Likewise, it was really nice talking to you. Bye, Holly.
Yeah. Bye-bye.